Hello, Year 10s. I'm going to be going through the poem Wolf Photographer, and I'm going to be going through this poem and we'll be looking at structure, language, and themes. Now, this week's poem is based on the theme of guilt and shame, and we'll be exploring that in depth a bit later. But firstly, let's try and familiarize ourselves with the poet who wrote the poem Wolf Photographer. So, Wolf Photographer was written by a poet called Caroline Duffy. She's a very well known poet and was the UK's Poet Laureate. And she was appointed by the Queen. So a Poet Laureate is basically the nation's poet, and they cover very important national events, and they compose poems for these special events and occasions. So this poem was written in 1985, and as you may have guessed from the title, we said the poem will be in the perspective of this wolf photographer. So before we start looking and having an in-depth look at the poem, let's have a look at the context of the poem first. So this poem goes through the wolf photographer developing the photographs they have had. So they've taken some photographs and then they're kind of going through the process of developing those photographs. In those days, you basically had to use what they call a darkroom, which would slowly reveal the images that the photographer had taken. So the first stanza, as we will get into, talks of him sifting through these images and trying to figure out which images he wants to be developed in this darkroom. Now these rooms usually had no external light, and that's why they were called the darkroom, and they often were like very dark red. So this will be really, really significant when it comes to us actually looking at the analysis of the poem, because it's set in this dark room. Another interesting point to note is that the poet Caroline Duffy was actually friends with a few wolf photographers, which made her account sound quite real when she was actually making this poem. Okay, so there's a number of themes that will arise in the poem. We're going to be looking at guilt and shame in more detail, but other themes that come up is things like memory. So it's like the photographer remembering the photographs. There's a lot of anger and resentment in the poem as well, on the speaker's job and this idea that they don't care, which also shows a dismissal of the people sent out to take these pictures. So that was his job, to take these pictures. So guilt and shame also plays a part in this too, because the photographer kind of questions his own sense of morals, and this in turn allows him to have that personal conflict on right versus wrong. So looking at the form and structure, we'll go in depth a bit later about this, but in general, there's a very regular structure of stanzas and rhyming throughout, which shows exactly how the photographer kind of tries to put order into this chaos of war. And the poem is also told in third-person perspective, which kind of distances us from the photographer. And this may be intentional to show that the distance is kind of showing that the readers of the newspapers don't really care too much about what they're actually reading. When they see the wolf photographer's images, they kind of have this fleeting moment of sadness, or they kind of disregard the actual raw emotions in those pictures. So the poem is told in third person, as we said, and we'll go in depth in the language used in the poem, but just make a note of the kind of more important quotes that will come up as we're going along. So this is kind of helping us to get a sense of the message that the speaker is telling us, and the person in the poem who is kind of the perspective of this wolf photographer. So the wolf photographer uses emotive language used to show these troubled memories, and they use metaphors like spools of suffering, these plosive sounds which sound very powerful. It says Beirut, Belfast. It's almost as if it's like a click of a camera or an explosion. So they have these very powerful words. So they have more emotive and resentful language in blood stained into foreign dust, and they do not care. And we'll go in depth in these a bit later, but just kind of familiarize yourself with this and just have a think about these words they're using here. So let's look at the poem itself now. I'm going to read out the poem. And I suggest that after I do read out the poem, that you kind of go back and read it yourself, and just kind of, just take a minute to just read it after I read it to you. So it says, in his dark room, he's finally alone, with the spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church, and here priests preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slope in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seems to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost, he remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval, without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So really a powerful, powerful poem there. Okay, so we'll be going through this stanza by stanza, focusing on language, structure, and anything else that we see in terms of the theme of guilt and shame. But before we do that, we'll go through the overall gist of the poem and the overall structure of the poem. So as we said earlier, it's quite a regular structure. So in the poem overall, we can see it's got 4 stanzas, and each stanza has 6 lines. So they are all of equal length. The poem has a very tight and controlled structure, so the rhyme scheme stays constant all the way through. It has an A, B, B, C, D, D structure all the way through. And, we can kind of make a note of that and what we think that might suggest. You could say that this is strict and controlled, a controlled structure to kind of reflect the war photographer's job, who's trying to impose order in this chaos of war. He's trying to make sense of it. He's trying to impose some sort of order there. And this acts as a juxtaposition, as on the other hand, the speaker tells us of this chaos of war, but shows that everything that comes out of this, so in this case, the newspaper will be structured, and it will show a very fleeting outrage that disappears as quickly as it comes. So people kind of return to their ordinary lives, and it's like they go back to their very structured lives. Okay, so there's the idea that the war photographer is trying to show us that the realities of war are there, but nothing really changes. The poem also uses a sort of a cyclical structure, because it always begins with the war photographer coming back from a trip, and then he's in his dark room where he's finally alone, as it says in the beginning. He's in this dark room, he's finally alone, and then it ends with him going back out on another trip at the bottom. Yeah, so he goes back into the aeroplane. So this idea of like a cyclical structure, it kind of ends where it begins, and it shows him journeying to and from a war zone. So it kind of shows you maybe things don't change because he's back doing the thing that he kind of is resenting himself for doing. Okay, so let's focus on the first stanza. So we're just looking at the first stanza here. Okay, so let's focus on the first stanza. Right, so we're going to pick out some symbolism here. So already from the outset, it starts off with a dark room and talks this red light. So we're looking at this part and red light. And both these are quite sinister, and it kind of gives us kind of evil connotation, and this kind of contrasts quite greatly with the religious imagery in this stanza, where the photographer kind of talks about church and mass. So we have church and mass here in the same stanza, as somewhere being quite dark and being quite red, and symbolizing something quite dangerous. So it kind of backs up the overall contrast in the poem, because constantly we're seeing this good versus bad in this poem, and it kind of contrasts this throughout, and we see that in the first stanza as well. So as we picked out earlier, this quote, suffering set out in ordered rows. So if we think about this idea of the ordered rows, it could represent or remind us of war graves. And interestingly, and again it goes back to this idea of being structured in this portrayal of death, we know that this isn't really the reality of war. We know that war isn't structured. War is very destructive. But we see that everything is kind of set out in ordered rows. So the photos are set out in ordered rows, and it reminds us of death and war. Another thing that's interesting to note is all flesh is grass. So this is another interesting quote, and this is actually a biblical reference, meaning that life is fleeting and there is a sense of a fleeting nature in human life. So it's showing us the fragility of life, and shows that the war photographer is addressing this and showing acknowledgement of this. As we mentioned earlier, there are plosives in line 6 here. So we have this Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. All of these are plosives, and this is basically when you have a consonant that's produced by stopping the airflow using your teeth, lips, or palate. So we have a very strong emphasis on p and b sounds. And this is very, very quick paced. And you could kind of say it sounds a bit like gunfire here. So it's really, really important to note that they're using these plosives to kind of show a very, very powerful symbolism here. We could also mention the caesura happening at each point. After each point, there's a full stop. So it's forcing us to stop here. So the caesura at each point is definitely forcing us to stop here, and we think about the realities of war and the realities of these places that are affected by war. So it starts off very, very powerful, and there's the idea that, you know, people are haunted by the experience in the pictures that are coming back to England, and we kind of get a sense that the photographer, although he's haunted by these images, going back to England kind of gives him that escape. And we go through, you know, the spores of suffering. He uses this very, very important technique here. He uses a sibilant, and this is what I like to call alliteration for words beginning with S. So lots of S's in close succession in one line here. And this shows that he basically emphasizes that there's a dark nature in the photos that he actually takes. So the photographer shows that the photographs, you know, kind of expresses a sense of suffering here. So we mentioned the sinister connotation with the color red, but there's also this idea that the photographer is back finally in this room. So it kind of shows that this is also a safe place for the photographer. It symbolizes a place that softly glows. So we have this adverb, softly, that shows a sense of comfort amongst this anguish that he's feeling. Okay, so on to the next stanza, so stanza 2. It's important to note that he's having a hard time processing the images that he's taken. It talks of his hands, which did not tremble then. And this kind of shows some irony now, because he had a very steady hand when he took the photos, but now that he's back, he's finding it quite hard. So this may hint at the photographer suffering from PTSD. He definitely could be suffering from PTSD here. Another thing to note that's really important is the separation of rural England here. So we have a caesura again. We can say it's kind of splitting the sentences apart here. So it's quite important to note this. It's like there is a separation from the realities of war on the people who he brings these photos back to. So, you know, the newspaper readers. It then gets into some more stereotyping of British weather, contrasting with the events of a war zone. And it shows us that there's this dull stability of home. So there's this idea that, you know, only ordinary pain affects people, and that it goes as quickly as it comes. We also have a rhyming couplet here. So beneath the feet, nightmare of heat. And this emphasizes the vulnerability and danger that the children of war experience here. And this is, you know, where we kind of start to get a sense of guilt here. Know that the war photographer acknowledges that the experience of some of these children are different depending on where they are. So if they're affected by war or not. Okay, so stanza 3, it again starts to build some tension here. We definitely start to see a building of tension here. The war photographer is sounding increasingly more serious, and he also shows a bit more anger here and a bit more resentment. So he's definitely building some tension here, and he changes the tone of the poem. So the poem being in the present tense here allows us to also see what is happening through the lens of the photographer. And although this is in third person, as we know, it's quite distant in this stanza, but I still feel like we do get to see a sense of how it feels being a war photographer, and how this is now affecting him psychologically. And the caesura shows this. And something is happening here. So we can see something is happening. It stops. The caesura here is forcing us to stop yet again. And then we start to see some double meaning in the part where it says, you know, faintingly starts to twist. before his eyes. And that's really, really important to note here, because it shows us that the subject in these photos is, suffering here. And this idea that it's twisting. And this could be kind of the anguish that the person's feeling in the actual photograph, but it also could show how the photographer is feeling as he's looking at this. So it's an important quote to note here. Also, if you're thinking about this idea of a half-formed ghost, this is really important, and obviously this is a metaphor. It shows the origins of the photo. It may also imply that the subject of the photo may be dead, but it could also represent other things. It's very ambiguous, so we can pick out another explanation of this as well. So it could be a half-formed memory, maybe, perhaps. It could also kind of show us that, his existence is now half formed, or as the picture is developing, it's coming out, but it's kind of just showing half of what he's gone through. An important thing to note here is also the personal pronoun he. So he remembers the cries, which also emphasizes a namelessness, and that shows that he's one of many. But again, we also always see this sense of detachment. And again, you see the theme of guilt coming up here again in this tone. So it's like we're very detached from him. We don't know much about him. So again, expressing some sort of guilt there. The adjective foreign here, into foreign dust, is very interesting here, because it could emphasize the fact that, all these things are quite far away. And again, there's this sense of detachment once again, because it seems as though it's like an outsider problem that doesn't really affect everyone, except on a very minuscule scale, and maybe just for a fleeting moment if you see it in a newspaper. Okay, so moving on to stanza 4. Stanza 4 ends with the poem as strongly as it starts, really, because it starts talking about the number of pictures that he's actually taken. So it starts with 100 agonies, showing the number of pictures that he's taken, and how from these agonies that he's actually captured, only 5 or 6 will be chosen for this, this shock factor, which kind of sort of dismisses the other 90-something pictures of this agony that he's captured. So we see a use of pun here in this idea of black and white. But also it's this idea of, obviously it's going to be printed in black and white, but he's kind of picking out another message here. So it's this idea of black and white in terms of morality. War is black and white. It's really structured. There are no grey areas. There's no reflection on how this affects humanity. We see some juxtapositions in this, and this stanza very clearly shows a reaction to these pictures. So we have tears juxtaposition with more comfortable images in this as well. So we can see they have tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So it's this idea that the emotion of these photographs are only taken in for a second, and we can almost see, an angry tone here from the war photographer, as it shows that, their tears are meaningless, and that there's only a very small moment that they kind of, have empathy or sympathy towards it, and it doesn't have more than a minute's reaction. It's just a part of the day. So we see the photographer is staring impassively now towards the end. And that shows he's again gone back into having this no emotion as he readies himself to do this all over again. Throughout the poem, it feels as though there's a constant battle here between the photographer on his own personal conflicts on how he feels. He knows that this is his livelihood, this is how he earns his living, but he has trouble expressing how he feels. So does he show emotions? Does he identify with the newspaper readers? Does he feel like he's the same as them in some way or another? Is he only outraged for a moment? How does he actually feel? Why does he go back to feeling numb and helpless? How does that help him in carrying out his job again? He's really in a constant battle how he feels about his job, and he knows that this is how he earns his living. But at the very last part, it shows that he shows his sense of morality here, because he says, this is how I learn my living, but the collective pronoun, they do not care, is really powerful there. So, there's an emphasis on resentment here. He's very resentful. And it shows that he could be blaming multiple people here. So he could be referring to the public who, look at the newspapers and quickly forget. Or it could be the wide world who is apathetic about others suffering. Or it could be directed to us as readers of the poem. So you can make a note that, we will look at this poem and we may be doing the same thing. So we may quickly move on, forget about the poem as quickly as we've read it. So yeah, it's a very interesting poem here, and one that definitely gets you thinking.